Hey there, just a heads up, this episode of the Judo Science Podcast was created with help from AI. Some of the voices you'll hear are synthetic, but the ideas come from real research and real judo.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be stepping onto the mat and we're going to be diving deep into judo strategy.
Specifically, we're going to zero in on the fascinating world of leg throws, or as they're known in Japanese, Ashi Waza.
You know, every time I watch a high-stakes judo competition, I just find myself more and more fascinated by how crucial these leg techniques are becoming.
Absolutely, they're really evolving, and you're in the right place to learn all about it, quickly and thoroughly.
By the end of this, you'll have a much clearer understanding of why mastering these techniques is so vital in judo.
So, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to take a deep dive into two very interesting sources.
Okay.
The first is a research paper. It's called The Symmetry of Bilateral Ashi Waza Throws Execution in Youth U14 Category Judokas.
And we're going to see how young judokas are executing these throws.
Yeah, are they equally proficient on both the right and left sides?
Interesting. What's the second source?
The second one is an article called The Increasing Importance of Ashi Waza in High-Level Competition.
Okay, so it's all about how these leg techniques are evolving and becoming so essential at the elite level.
Exactly. What we're going to do today is kind of connect the dots between what's happening at the foundational level with these young judokas and the cutting-edge strategies that we're seeing in top-level tournaments.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's start by unpacking this concept of symmetry in judo. What exactly does that mean, especially when we're talking about younger athletes?
Well, bilateral quality, which refers to being equally skilled on both sides of your body, is actually a real hallmark of a highly developed judoka.
So using your arms and legs effectively on both sides.
Exactly, and that leads to this really well-rounded physical development and ability on the mat.
Right, it makes sense, balance and all that.
Yeah. And the research paper that we mentioned actually looks specifically at U14 judokas.
Okay, so they're kind of at that critical early stage of their competitive development.
Yeah, and it investigated how balanced they are in performing three common Ashiwaza throws: Osotogari, Ouchigari, and Uchimata.
For those who may not be familiar with those terms, can you give us a quick explanation of what those throws involve?
Of course. Osotogari is known as the major outer reap, Ouchigari is the major inner reap, and Uchimata is the inner thigh reap. Each one uses a different leg action to sweep or reap the opponent's leg, causing them to lose balance and fall.
Okay, so three different ways to use the legs for a throw. And what did the study find in these young judokas? Were they equally good on both sides?
It's interesting, actually. The study didn't find a statistically significant difference in how well they performed these throws between their dominant and their non-dominant side at this age.
So those U14 judokas, they seem to be pretty balanced in how they're using their legs for these throws.
Yeah, they are showing good overall symmetry, which is quite impressive at that age. However, there was a bit of a trend.
Oh, what was that?
Although it wasn't a huge difference statistically, the researchers observed that across all three throws, the scores tended to be a bit lower when the judokas used their left side.
Which, for most people, would also be their non-dominant side.
Right, so even though they're showing good symmetry overall, there's this little hint of a preference for their stronger side emerging.
That makes you think, even at that foundational level, a slight imbalance exists.
Yeah. What's the takeaway here? Well, this suggests that maybe focused training on your non-dominant side, starting at a young age, could be beneficial.
It's not just good practice. It could actually turn into a competitive advantage as you go up the ranks.
Exactly. Now, moving on to the specific throws, were there any that these young athletes were particularly good at or struggled with more?
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Did the researchers find any differences in their proficiency across the three throws?
They did, actually. Osotogari consistently got the best scores. Seems like these kids really have a knack for that major outer reap.
Okay, interesting. So Osotogari is their strength. What about the one they struggled with?
Well, it seems Uchimata, that inner thigh reap, consistently received the lowest scores across the board.
Makes you wonder why, right? Why is it that they were so good at one and had a bit more difficulty with another?
The researchers believe that this is linked to the judo curriculum itself.
So the way judo is taught might be influencing how these young athletes are developing their skills.
Precisely. Techniques like Osotogari and Uchigari are typically taught earlier on in a judoka's training.
Gotcha. So the more exposure they have to a specific technique early on, the better they become at it.
Right. It's all about building those foundational skills early. Osotogari, for example, is usually introduced around the 5th kyu level.
Which is, for our listeners who may not be judo experts, kind of an intermediate belt rank.
Yes, exactly. And uchigari comes in around the 7th kyu, which is a slightly lower rank. So these young athletes have had more time to practice and refine these movements.
Ah, that makes sense. More mat time, more practice, better execution.
Now, uchimata is a different story. It's usually not taught until around the 4th kyu level.
So later in their training. But it's also, if I remember correctly, a more complex movement.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It demands a lot more coordination, strength, balance, and really precise timing.
Especially that second step is so crucial in Uchimata if you don't get that right.
It's not going to work. So it naturally takes more time and effort to master. And that's not even considering doing it equally well on both sides.
That's a real aha moment for me. The structure of judo training and how complex these movements are really impacts a judoka's development.
And that leads us to a critical point. The researchers highlighted the transition between the U14 and U16 age group.
That's when things start to get serious.
Right. Judo research suggests that this is when those significant differences in performance between the judoka's dominant and non-dominant sides really start to show.
So those little asymmetries we saw in the U14s, they could become much bigger problems later on.
They could. This emphasizes the importance of developing those non-dominant side skills early.
Get that good balanced foundation in those younger years because later on it's going to be harder to correct. Okay, so we have a clearer picture of symmetry in young judokas. But now let's shift our focus to the big leagues. Okay, what's the underlying principle that connects all these techniques?
It's all about using your leg to either hook, reap, or sweep your opponent's foot.
Gotcha. So the names might differ, but the fundamental idea is the same.
Right. The key difference usually comes down to how much force is needed, and this depends a lot on the friction between the opponent's foot and the mat.
Ah, I see. So on a slippery mat, a sweep might be enough. But if their foot is really planted, you'd need more force with a reap or a hook.
Precisely. You need to adjust your technique based on the resistance you're encountering.
Makes perfect sense. So it's not just about knowing the technique, it's about understanding the physics of the situation as well.
Absolutely. And to understand the leg movement in these techniques, the article uses a really cool analogy, a physical pendulum.
A pendulum. How does that relate to a judo throw?
Well, think of it like this. Your leg swings like a pendulum, and then it makes contact with your opponent's foot.
Ah, I see. So it's all about that momentum and the force of the impact.
Exactly. And they even introduced this idea of a variable damping physical pendulum to model the different actions.
Like barai, gari, and geik.
You got it. It all depends on the friction.
So even these seemingly simple sweeps and hooks are actually rooted in some pretty cool physics.
Right, and mastering that swing and collision can lead to some really powerful throws.
And the article gave a specific example, right? They actually calculated the force involved.
They did. In one scenario, they estimated the impact force to be around 390 newtons.
Wow. That's a lot of force. It really highlights how efficient these throws can be.
But here's what's really fascinating. How these techniques are evolving in modern competition. The article talks about how elite competitors are introducing variations to these classical Waza forms.
So they're not just sticking to the traditional techniques, they're experimenting and innovating.
Exactly. For example, the article mentioned Nakamura Yukimasa. He sometimes performs Kosotogari using his thigh for the sweep instead of the traditional foot sweep.
Interesting. So a slight modification to the classic technique.
Right. Then they got Tobitsuka Masatoshi. He's got this really quick, tactical Kosotogari that looks almost like the off-grip Korean version.
So he's adapting the technique to take advantage of specific openings or weaknesses in his opponent's stance.
Exactly. And then there's Masuchi Katsuyuki, who has his own unique interpretation of Kosotobeike.
Wow. So even though the names might stay the same, the way these techniques are executed can look quite different in modern high-level judo.
That's right. It's fascinating to see how these athletes are constantly pushing the boundaries of technique.
It's like they're taking these age-old principles and adapting them to the demands of modern competition.
But here's the thing. Even though they're experimenting with variations, they often still adhere to the fundamental biomechanical principles.
So they're not just throwing those principles out the window, they're building on them.
Exactly. A lot of these techniques work based on what's called a couple.
A couple. What does that mean in this context?
It refers to the application of two simultaneous opposing forces. So, for example, your leg might be sweeping your opponent's leg in one direction while your arms are pulling them in another.
Ah, I see. Creating that imbalance by pulling and pushing at the same time.
Right. This simultaneous action creates instability, which makes the throw much more effective.
It's all about disrupting their balance in a very specific way.
Precisely. But the article mentions one interesting exception to this.
Oh, what's that?
The ko-uchigari variation used by Korean judoka Onkang.
Right. I remember reading about that. He seems to be doing something different.
He is. His version is more of a lever-based action, often used as a block against the opponent's foot.
So he's not so much sweeping as he is blocking.
Exactly. It's a fascinating departure from the traditional biomechanics of ko-uchigari.
It really shows how judokas from different regions can have different interpretations of these techniques.
Absolutely. And there's one technique that seems to have remained relatively consistent.
Which one is that?
Ko-uchigori, the minor inner reap. It hasn't seen as many variations.
So maybe that classic Kodokan form is just so effective that it doesn't need much tweaking.
That's one interpretation. It's really interesting to see how some things stay the same while others evolve.
It's that interplay between tradition and innovation.
Exactly. And it's important to note that these Kawaza techniques are gaining popularity not just because they're effective, but also because they're quick and efficient.
Ah, so in the fast-paced world of high-level judo, speed is key.
Absolutely. Being able to execute a quick and effective throw can give you a huge advantage.
Okay, so let's wrap this all up. We started by looking at symmetry in young judokas. We saw that while they're pretty balanced, there's a slight preference for their dominant side, and more complex throws take longer to master.
Right.
Then we talked about how Ashi Waza, especially those Kawaza techniques, are becoming crucial at the elite level.
And how judokas are developing these really interesting variations while still often adhering to those core biomechanical principles.
Exactly. It's a fascinating mix of tradition and innovation.
For aspiring judokas, the takeaway is clear. Develop your skills on both sides from the beginning.
Build that strong, balanced foundation. It's going to pay off in the long run.
Absolutely. And for those who enjoy watching judo, it's amazing to see how these techniques are evolving and how athletes are finding new and creative ways to use them.
It's really a testament to the depth and complexity of this sport.
This deep dive has given us so much to think about.
It really has. And it leaves us with a final thought. How might future training methodologies need to adapt to help judokas develop even greater symmetry and master these evolving techniques?
Maybe we need to start focusing on these things at an even younger age.
It's a fascinating question. It makes you think about the future of judo training.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of judo.
We hope you found this informative and thought-provoking.
Until next time.
Take care.
Next time on the Judo Science Podcast, Episode 8, the Judo Grip Game and How to Control Kumikata.